Leading our discussion is Melanie Israel, who serves as a research associate in our Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society. She earned her bachelor's degree in history at the University of Texas. Prior to joining Heritage, she worked in the office of Senator Ted Cruz as a professional staff member for the Senate Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Oversight, Agency Action, Federal Rights, and Federal Courts. Please join me in welcoming Melanie Israel. Melanie?
All right, and first of all, just want to thank everybody who was able to come today. If you're joining us in person or following along online, I want to go ahead and just kick off this discussion because I know that we have so much to cover, but I do want to set the tone and set the stage a little bit. Our discussion today is going to be both reflective and forward-looking. We're 1 year into the Trump administration, almost exactly. He was inaugurated a year ago as of this week. So just to kind of set the stage, and these are some things that I talk about in the copy of a paper that I hope everybody was able to pick up before you came in. But last January, a pro-life majority in the Senate and the House of Representatives and a president committed to defending innocent life from conception to natural death started pursuing a pro-life agenda. And so in this past year, there have been a number of pro-life policy victories, but there's still much to be done in 2018 and beyond. And so we're going to talk about some of these victories, and we're going to talk about some of the things that are still on the to-do list on this pro-life agenda. And so I want to go ahead and turn it over and introduce our panelists. First of all, immediately to my left, we have Autumn Christensen. She serves as policy director at the Susan B. Anthony List. And in this position, she helps advance their policy goals across the federal government. And, well, this includes executive and Congress. She has 15 years of Capitol Hill experience with domestic and global health issues. Prior to joining SBA List, she was the director of the Congressional Pro-Life Caucus in the House of Representatives. So she has extensive experience working with members of Congress and leadership and committees on advancing pro-life legislation. And then to her left, we've got Deanna Wallace. She is a staff counsel at Americans United for Life, and she consults with state and federal legislators. She provides testimony in favor of life-affirming legislation and helps create strategic legal tools to advance life in law. She's also the editor of AUL's excellent publication, Defending Life. It's often called the Pro-Life Playbook. It provides a lot of model legislation for both federal and state legislators. And she also contributed to AUL's report, Unsafe: How the Public Health Crisis in America's Abortion Clinics Endangers Women. And prior to joining AUL, she was the legislative director for Louisiana Right to Life, where she helped to pass legislation that's made Louisiana one of the most pro-life states in America. And so I want to turn it over to the two of you and kind of give you a chance to talk a little bit more about your respective organizations, and then we'll kick things off and we'll talk about the policy goals. So Autumn, over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about pro-life priorities both in the administration and in Congress. I, of course, as was mentioned, work for the Susan B. Anthony List. We are an organization founded to elect pro-life women to Congress. That is very much the heart of what we do, but we have since built out a very robust Capitol Hill presence, lobbying operation, and created a think tank, the Charlotte Lozier Institute, which provides in-depth research on pressing issues related to abortion, bioethics, and euthanasia. So anyone familiar with the Susan B. Anthony List probably knows that we were very involved in the 2016 election, knocking on over 1 million doors, spending $18 million to defeat Hillary Clinton and maintain a pro-life Senate. During the course of that campaign, our president, Marjorie Dannenfelser, secured a letter from then-candidate Trump focusing on 4 key pro-life commitments. And those are nominating pro-life judges, signing the pain-capable Unborn Child Protection Act into law, defunding the abortion industry, and in particular, Planned Parenthood, instead redirecting those funds to other other comprehensive women's health centers, and then finally stopping taxpayer funding for abortion by making the Hyde Amendment permanent. So each of those priorities are really the focus of our legislative and executive agenda. The issues we're working on are closely tied to each of those 4 priorities as we go into the second session of this Congress.
So Americans United for Life, we pick up about where SBA leaves off. Whenever these amazing women and men that they help support get elected, we come in with our model legislation and our attorneys, and we help them pass pro-life laws, whether that's at the federal level or at the state level. A lot of those laws are in our Defending Life, which we mentioned earlier. It actually got released on Monday, so please go and download your copy. They make me say that. But we focus primarily in the states, but we do have a large voice as well in the federal legislative realm as well. And our priority is to come up with legislation and a legal strategy that will overturn Roe. But more than that, on the state level, we focus on laws that will be in place once Roe is overturned and that this issue is ultimately returned to the states. We think it's very important that that foundation is there and in place so that when this happens and when these pro-life Supreme Court justices finally get rid of this badly decided unconstitutional Roe decision, that every state has protections in place to protect not only our innocent children, but also the women who are hurt by abortion.
Well, thank you. I hope that gives everybody a little bit of additional background of our panelists and the organizations that they represent. So I just want to go ahead and dive right in with a topic that's been in the news for the last several days, and that is conscience. I'm sure most everybody has seen that HHS has announced a new conscience and religious freedom division within the Office for Civil Rights. They've proposed a new conscience regulation, and we'll dive into that. But I want to rewind a little bit and talk about some of the other action that happened on conscience earlier in the Trump administration, and that has to do with interim final rules that were released regarding the contraception mandate in Obamacare. A mandate that's been involved in years and years and years of litigation. The Obama administration was not very successful defending that mandate, and it created a lot of problems. So I was hoping that you could dive in a little bit, talk about the background, the litigation, and what those interim final rules did.
Yeah, so there was a lot of discussion within the Obama administration with groups like Planned Parenthood about what exactly the final rule for their administration was going to be regarding these benefits that were required and mandated under Obamacare as preventative. And not only were normal forms of hormonal birth control included in that, but at the behest of these pro-choice groups, these abortifacient emergency contraceptive types of drugs were included as well. And there, obviously, we know, were lots of different organizations that had both ethical, moral, and religious objections to being involved in the provision of those drugs, whether it was their business or if it was the Little Sisters of the Poor. They simply felt that they could not do that. And so there was all the litigation. I think some of it is still actually pending because the final rules just went into effect, so there has to be some settlements. But we all know that Hobby Lobby was a great win for conscience rights, but there still needs to be that protection there. And so we were really happy whenever the Trump administration announced that they were going to rescind that rule because it was a badly implemented rule in the first place. And now we have the new conscience rights division within the HHS that we hope will really be able to enforce what's already supposed to be in federal law, the conscience protections. But we can see through this kind of evolution from the Obama administration to the Trump administration that it's really important that these are permanent instead of just rules that can be reissued every single time we get a new president. And that's why we're very vocally in support of the Conscience Protection Act to make that the law of the land and not just an administrative rule.
And it seems like there's been a lot of mischaracterization in the press as these various conscience protections have come out, whether it was regarding the contraception mandate back in October, those interim final rules, which, of course, probably shocking nobody, are being challenged. And there have been some injunctions issued, and so all of that litigation is still pending. So it's still not ultimately resolved, and likely won't ever be ultimately resolved unless Congress can repeal Obamacare and give us a healthcare system that truly helps people get health care that allows them to meet their needs and reflects their values. But that might be a discussion a little bit too broad to try to dive into today. But it definitely seems like these conscience protections that have been the law of the land in some cases for over 4 decades are all of a sudden being portrayed in the media as being controversial. And that just seems like a very interesting characterization.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting development to see the idea of, for instance, doctors not wanting to perform abortions being portrayed as extreme and out of the norm, when in reality, even as far back as the initial Roe decision, it was always part of abortion law. Even as weird as that abortion law has evolved, they've never, ever said that a doctor should be able to be forced to violate their conscience and perform an abortion. And so we're seeing that at so many different levels, whether it's the contraceptive mandate or these new state laws trying to force pregnancy centers to promote abortion, doctors to perform or refer for abortions. And I know there's lots of concern on this assisted suicide front as well, as more states battle that, as to whether or not doctors will be forced to do that as well. And so this is something that's always been the bedrock of our nation is conscience, whether that conscience belief comes from your religion or your morals, your ethics. That's something that our nation has always been very, very firm on protecting. And so I don't know why that's become weird all of a sudden, but it's should be really common sense that we should protect that.
And we'll dive in a little bit more specifically on some legislation that would affirmatively protect rights of conscience later, but I wanted to turn over to Autumn and talk a little bit more on the abortion funding question. And there have been some victories in the last year, and so maybe we can start with that. We had a congressional victory with Congress overturning what many folks have characterized as President Obama's parting gift to Planned Parenthood. So I'd love to hear some more about that from you. And also at the administrative level, policies like United Nations Population Fund funding and the Mexico City policy. So hopefully maybe you can give us a background of these issues and then talk about what those victories were.
Sure. Well, starting with the Title X program, which for anybody who isn't deeply steeped in the federal government, you wonder what in the world is the Title X program. So this is, of course, a federal grant program to fund family planning that was created in the 1970s to stop population growth. The program has not been reauthorized since the 80s, and yet it continues to receive $286 million each year. The program has very much become a slush fund for Planned Parenthood. It constitutes their second largest federal funding stream. And as if that weren't enough, at the end of the Obama administration, a new regulation was put forward and finalized to require states to make sure that they pass on their Title X funds to Planned Parenthood. So as if it were not enough that many states voluntarily gave money to Planned Parenthood, they wanted to stop any states from cutting Planned Parenthood out of their Title X program. So a little known mechanism called the Congressional Review Act allows Congress to disapprove of legislation or of regulations that that were issued within a certain time period. So the time period allowed for Congress to consider H.J. Res. 43 legislation to disapprove of that parting gift. That passed the House and then passed the Senate. Interestingly, it passed the Senate by a vote of 51 to 50, with the vice president casting the deciding vote. And one of the things that was very exciting about that is that, of course, Vice President Pence has been a longtime supporter of the pro-life agenda in general, but specifically as a member of the House, carried the bill to defund Planned Parenthood. And so for him to be that deciding vote was a really exciting moment.
Right. And one of the other things that happened right in the first several days of the Trump administration was implementation of the Mexico City policy. And this is a policy that's been essentially a political ping pong ball ever since President Reagan. It's been in place during Republican administrations and then rescinded under Democrat administrations. So could you tell us a little bit more about the background of why this policy came about in the first place and how it's ended up being this political ping pong ball and what the Trump administration did to actually expand and strengthen the policy?
Sure. So the federal government, of course, in the United States, we have international programs to help and assist people overseas with humanitarian needs. And many of those are health needs, whether it's HIV/AIDS or maternal health, vaccination programs for children, a wide range of services that we provide. And that's part of our diplomacy, and that's part of the message that we send to people overseas, that we want to offer a helping hand. So the question then becomes, well, what kind of helping hand should we offer? And the Mexico City policy, as it was called in the 1980s, when President Reagan announced it at a conference in Mexico City, so that's where the title came from, that policy said, you know, when it comes to family planning and reproductive health, we're only going to fund those organizations that do not promote or perform abortion. Because the last thing we want to do as a nation is export the tragedy of abortion to countries that are, particularly to developing countries. So that policy was in place during the Reagan and the first Bush administration and reinstated again in the second Bush administration. What President Trump did at the beginning of his administration was to announce the Protecting Life and Global Health Assistance initiative, and this not only applied the Mexico City policy of not giving money to organizations that promote or perform abortion to the Family Planning and Reproductive Health account, but to cover all global health. So going from a pot of $575 million to a pot of nearly $9 billion. Now this policy applies to all of those funds. And that means regardless of whether an organization is providing HIV/AIDS or contraception or maternal health services, they have to make sure that any foreign non-governmental organization complies with this requirement, that they're not promoting abortion, because that's not the platform that we want to present in our foreign policy and diplomacy. And this was especially important because one of the most egregious organizations receiving funds during the Obama years was Marie Stopes International. This is an organization that is radically pro-abortion. One of the things that we discovered that they did in Kenya was to start a social franchising network where they sent representatives out throughout the country. Not only did they do abortions, but tried to convince other physicians in Kenya to carry out abortions and sell them the drugs that they would need to carry out abortions on women in Kenya. So we wanted to make sure that Marie Stopes would no longer receive funds from any of these funding sources. And then UNFPA, of course, is the UN agency responsible for family planning, and they have worked hand in glove with China's one-child policy for the last several decades, and continue to get $32.5 million appropriated by Congress. Excuse me. So we were very, very pleased when this administration said, nope, we're going to cut off those funds. We're going to invoke what's called the Kemp-Kasten Amendment, and we're going to say no more money to the UNFPA. Of course, in both of these cases, whether it's the Protecting Life policy or whether it's UNFPA, the former recipients of federal funds have a choice to make. They can say, we'll get out of the abortion business and take U.S. taxpayer dollars, or they can refuse the funds, get the funds elsewhere, and continue their abortion agenda. Unfortunately, these organizations have chosen abortion over U.S. dollars, so those funds have now been redirected to other sources.
And I think that's a very key point, that these funds, we're not talking about cutting funds, we're talking about directing funds so that they're going toward groups and organizations whose goals align with the policy of the United States. That's been another one of those characterizations, it seems like, in the media that kind of misses the mark. Mm-hmm. One of the other things that I was hoping we could turn to today was talking about Obamacare. Obviously, healthcare reform took up a ton of oxygen over the course of the last year, and a large part of that discussion had to do with the question of abortion and Obamacare. So I was hoping we could talk a little bit about not just the defunding Planned Parenthood policy goal, but also one of the actions that the Trump administration took last fall, the same time they issued those final rules regarding the contraception mandate on segregation of funding and making sure that people aren't paying for abortions without their knowledge.
Sure. So, as I think many in the pro-life movement know, Obamacare represents the largest deviation from the what's called the Hyde Amendment since Roe versus Wade. So, what happened in Obamacare was, instead of the Hyde Amendment that says no money's going to go to pay for abortion and no money's going to go to insurance plans that cover abortion. That abortion is not part of the package of services that the U.S. government wants to support and subsidize through premium payments. That would be how the Hyde Amendment would be applied. But instead what happened was Section 1303 of Obamacare did an end around the Hyde Amendment and instead said Obamacare plans may cover abortion. And in order to do so, they need to charge an abortion surcharge, but they could include abortion coverage in those Obamacare plans. So two things became evident as Obamacare went into effect in 2014. First, it became evident that the surcharge was not being collected separately as required by law, and even more so that constituents and individuals purchasing plans on the exchanges were not even able to identify whether the plans covered abortion or not. So the only real solution to this is to actually apply the Hyde Amendment, and that's incredibly important to us as an organization. But until Congress can get a bill through and reconciliation, obviously we'll talk about that a little bit, but until then, we really want to see this administration crack down on the failure of insurance companies to comply with the law. We found the guidance that came out in October stated that insurance companies needed to make sure that they displayed prominently in the summary of benefits whether abortion was covered or not. And even so, our research arm, the Lozier Institute, identified 150 plans in 5 states where you still could not identify whether abortion was even covered or not. And this is just, scratching the surface of the problem. And we certainly hope the administration will move further in enforcing the separate payment requirement. Because right now I think it's pretty clear the definition of separate is separate, and yet what is happening is Obamacare plans are hiding and embedding that abortion surcharge and making it very difficult for consumers to even know about the extent of the abortion coverage in these plans.
And it seems like this is the sort of thing, enforcing the law of the land, just like in the context of conscience, this shouldn't be controversial, and yet apparently it is.
And I think that's exactly why we were so happy to see that both the House passed Obamacare repeal and replace, and the Senate bills that were proposed and those that are still being discussed are careful to stop the flow of funding to abortion covering plans and to reinstate the Hyde Amendment and the Hyde Principle throughout the healthcare systems that come along to replace Obamacare. We were also very pleased on the issue of Planned Parenthood, very pleased that every bill that the House and Senate considered regarding in the reconciliation process to repeal and replace also made sure that Medicaid funds would no longer flow to Planned Parenthood. Medicaid is Planned Parenthood's biggest funding stream, and big abortion providers like Planned Parenthood, others, should not be benefiting from Medicaid dollars to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, and that needs to be stopped. And we were very thankful that the Congress included those issues, included that language in each of the bills that were proposed. And it was not the Planned Parenthood issue that brought down the health care bill, but other dynamics. So as we move forward, we will continue to insist that defunding Planned Parenthood needs to be a high priority.
Well, and speaking of Medicaid, just last week, the Trump administration issued another guidance letter regarding Medicaid. So I was hoping that you could explain a little bit about that and the background and how this came about, because the Susan B. Anthony list and a number of other pro-life organizations had been calling specifically for the Trump administration to do exactly what happened last Friday. So could you tell us a little bit more about that background and what the effect is going to be?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, of course, we feel strongly that it is the responsibility of Congress to completely cut off Medicaid funds to Planned Parenthood. That is the responsibility of Congress, but that has not yet happened. And in the meantime, there are states that would like to remove Planned Parenthood and other big abortion providers from their network of Medicaid providers. And in the Obama administration, when states started doing this, the Obama administration stepped up and said, well, we're going to send you all a letter that says, no, you can't. You cannot. You have to make sure that women have access to their choice of provider. And so that choice of provider requirement means that you cannot create rules or standards that would exclude abortion providers. So that kind of remained in place, and in September we have a coalition of state legislators, female state legislators, and 127 of our Women's Caucus members across the country signed a letter asking the administration to pull back that Obama-era letter. So that letter was pulled back last week. We are very glad for that. We know that this issue will continue to be litigated, but are very happy to see that the Trump administration has removed this barrier that was put up by the Obama administration.
And in making that announcement of rescinding that guidance letter, HHS came down very strongly on two fronts justifying rescinding that letter. First of all, that the Obama administration's letter was outside of what they're allowed to do administratively, that they had overstepped their bounds on an administrative procedures standpoint in interpreting the Medicaid free choice of provider provision. But also, I guess, more basically saying that what the Obama administration was trying to do was put the thumb on the scale in favor of these abortion organizations. And so it's very interesting. I've also seen a lot of media attention acting as though this guidance letter being rescinded immediately means that Planned Parenthood is going to lose all of its Medicaid funding, and that's not quite what this is doing. This is taking us back to the status quo before that guidance letter was in place, and of course, this is an issue that continues to be played out in courts. And now there's some circuit splits. Arkansas was most recently able to win in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, I think. Don't quote me on that. I could be wrong.
You're right.
There we go. Fourth Circuit. But there have been some decisions that went the other way, I believe, in the Seventh Circuit. And so this is definitely an issue that's not over by any means. But Deanna, I'm sure that's something that y'all are tracking, maybe setting up a potential Supreme Court.
Yeah, I think that will be something that heads to the Supreme Court in the next year or two. There, as you said, is a circuit split. The Fifth Circuit's still trying to decide if Louisiana can. And I think that part of the problem here is that you're right. It does tip the scale whenever Obama administration sent out this letter, but Trump rescinding this doesn't necessarily get rid of the problem. It does help because there is a certain amount of administrative deference that the courts give to when an administrative agency interprets their own rules. And so it certainly helps for the HHS to now be saying, well, this isn't necessarily what we think. But I think that it really hurts states like Louisiana, for instance. This is, we at Louisiana Right to Life, when I was there, passed the defunding of Planned Parenthood. And one of the reasons that we talked about was that Planned Parenthood Gulf Coast not only operates in Louisiana, it operates in Texas. And in Texas, they had settled with the state of Texas for Medicaid fraud, overbilling millions and millions of dollars. And that was one of the reasons that legislators were very concerned about funding Planned Parenthood of Gulf Coast, because they don't think that's a good steward of their taxpayer dollars. And for the Obama administration to come in and say, no, absolutely not, you can't do that, it really takes away state sovereignty on who they want with their partnership dollars to cover. So I think that there are going to be a lot of really interesting cases coming up on that now that the letter has been rescinded, and how judges interpret that going forward, I think will be very different, hopefully.
One of the other things that I wanted to talk about a little bit more is what else the administration can do at the administrative level when it comes to the question of abortion funding. We often hear from the other side that because of policies like the Hyde Amendment, tax dollars are not directly going towards abortion in most cases. But there's the question of fungibility, and that's something that comes up whether we're talking about Medicaid or a Title X grant or a Violence Against Women Act grant or any sort of grant or funding that can go toward abortion providers. So I was hoping, Autumn, maybe we can talk a little bit more specifically about this fungibility concern and maybe what the Trump administration can do additionally on the Title X front, maybe reviving some old regulations.
Yeah, I think that really gets at the point of program integrity, making sure that these federal programs are following the Hyde Amendment and are also putting forward the policies that best reflect the intent of the Hyde Amendment. So within, with the Medicaid program, if the state wants to say, you know, it is part of our effort to make sure that we are not in any way supporting abortion, we want to remove Planned Parenthood and other big abortion providers from our network, then that should be completely reasonable for them to do, in part from a program integrity standpoint. I think similarly, going back to that Title X program that I talked about earlier, the Title X program being this funding stream that has become a slush fund for Planned Parenthood, it was a good step to roll back what the Obama administration did, but more can be done. So during the Reagan and first Bush administrations, there were regulations that created a bright line of separation between abortion and family planning at these centers. And specifically, they made sure that abortion centers could not be co-located with family planning centers, so that you're walking in the same door to get your government-funded Title X contraception, that you're also walking through to get your abortion. That these two things, that abortion is not family planning, abortion should not be part of a family planning program. So co-location and then also referrals. So those regulations continue to be an important way to add some integrity to the Title X program, in the same way that states cutting abortion providers out of their Medicaid program would bring integrity there. And then, of course, as I mentioned, also within Obamacare, doing everything they can within Obamacare to roll back the free-for-all for abortion within Obamacare that was the case under the Obama administration.
And I think it's important to note that these Title X regulations from the Reagan era, they were upheld by the Supreme Court. We know that it's good policy, and the Trump administration could actually do more in addition to reinstating those regulations. They could include language that would not just take away a requirement for termination of pregnancy to be one of the items on the discussion table, but they could also affirmatively require that adoption be one of the topics discussed in this context, because right now, under current regulations, adoption is merely an optional topic. And so making sure that women know about their full range of options, life-affirming options, is something that the Trump administration could go the extra mile on.
And that's exactly what this is about. The question is, when federal tax dollars are used, what should they be used for, and what is the message that we want to send as taxpayers, and what is the message that Congress and the administration want to send about what is valuable? And certainly adoption over abortion is something that most Americans would agree with.
Well, Deanna, I want to turn to you and talk a little bit more specifically about legislation. We've been covering a lot of what the administration has been up to and what the administration can do. But on the legislative front, the really key bill that Congress has been pursuing has been the Pain Capable Unborn Child Protection Act to do away with painful, gruesome late-term abortions done after 5 months. And this is something that I know Americans United for Life has been very much involved in, not just at the federal level, but at the state level. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about both the state and federal efforts and how this all fits into the larger context of eventually overturning Roe versus Wade? Why 20 weeks? What's the overall strategy of this legislation?
So 20 weeks obviously is because of the science that says that at 20 weeks, a unborn child can feel pain. And there's been a lot of debate about whether or not that's actually science, but it is. There's a lot of great research out there. I know CLI has put out some great white papers talking about the medical evidence for this, and we use that in our legislation. We think it's really important to have these state findings or congressional findings, and that's something that was talked about a lot at the Supreme Court when the Partial Birth Abortion Act was finally upheld, was the congressional findings about the partial birth abortion, the medical necessity, and things like that. So it's really great to see the science that really does confirm the intense pain that these unborn children feel. And if you look at the polling, it's overwhelmingly supported by not only the average American, but by women. We want this bill. We inherently know as mothers and potential mothers that at 5 months, that's clearly a baby that deserves to be protected. There's no denying that. It's not a bundle of cells at that point. You can see it clearly. It moves around. You can sometimes see it through your belly. You might be able to talk on that. But the state level is really where it started, and I think that it's interesting that it also came from Nebraska, which is the first place to pass the partial birth abortion as well. Nebraska had a very unique reason to pass this bill, and that is because that is where Carhart located his practice. Leroy Carhart, one of the most notorious abortionists in our nation, who does abortions after 20 weeks, after 25 weeks, after 30 weeks. I'm not sure he has a limit. I don't think he's ever advertised one. And I think that Nebraska stood up very clearly and said, we do not want Carhart here. He is a stain on us as a state. So they passed partial birth abortion. They passed the pain-capable ban. And we've seen it, I think, in 20 states now that have passed this. And there's been very few challenges to it, honestly. There was a challenge in the Ninth Circuit, because it's the Ninth Circuit, but you've seen that there has been no touching it in Texas or in Louisiana, in Arkansas, because they know that these circuits are much more conservative. They don't want this to go to the Supreme Court, I think, because they don't want a repeat of the partial birth abortion ban. They don't want people to hear the science. They don't want people to actually have to think about aborting a child at 5 months, because that doesn't fit in with the narrative that abortion is early, it's safe, it's easy, it's no big deal, it's just a blob of cells. And so it's a very educational bill as well. And I think that it's so great that we're hearing about it on the federal level in a way that we haven't in the past few years. And we know that that's because we have an administration that would actually sign it. We have a majority that would actually pass it. And so we're very much looking forward to getting that vote in the next week or so.
That's the thing. I believe the House passed it for this session last fall, and then the Senate, it's still on the to-do list for the Senate. They did have a vote on it last Congress, of course, with the 60 vote threshold. That has its own challenges, but I know that there's a number of groups who are very intensely pushing for the Senate to have a vote on this, because so many people just want to see where their elected representatives fall on this issue. One of the other bills that recently had a vote in the House is the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. And this is another one of those bills that has been passed at the state level, hasn't gotten across the finish line at the federal level, but not from lack of trying. So could you talk a little bit about why this bill is necessary and maybe try to explain some of the opposition to it, if that's possible.
Sure. Well, the basis of this bill is pretty simple. If a baby is born alive after an attempted abortion, they should be given medical treatment. That should be pretty uncontroversial. Somehow it's not. It has passed in a number of states, but a lot of the opposition seems to be around either A, that this doesn't actually happen, or B, that it somehow interferes with the doctor's ability to perform an abortion in the first place. And we know that it's not true that it doesn't happen. Not only do we have testimony from nurses who have seen this happen, doctors who have seen this happen, but if you recall the videos from the Center for Medical Progress, you had a lot of talk about the way that Planned Parenthood and other abortion providers were changing the way that they did abortions in order to get the freshest, best material, which means they were trying to get a fresh baby. And it was easier for them to not, sorry, this is like hard to not rip these babies apart, to not poison them before they were taken from their mother's wombs. And because the more you do that, the less viable tissue, the least viable organs there are for them to then sell. And so we can tell from that there were probably more than the research would indicate of these babies actually being born alive because of the changes that they were doing in order to profit off of these children. So it's something that I think the average person is more aware of now than they were, and they should be, because this does happen. And we saw in the previous administration that President Obama, when he was a senator in Illinois, voted against allowing Illinois babies that were born after abortions to be provided with medical care. How someone can vote against that blows my mind. I think we were talking earlier, there were 6 Democrats that voted for born alive protections in the House. And I think that it really does show the extreme nature of the pro-abortion plank in the Democratic Party, that we can't even agree that babies that are born alive from a failed abortion deserve protection. And I don't think that that's in line with the value of the vast majority of Americans.
And Autumn, maybe you can touch a little bit on some of these values, because I know that Susan B. Anthony List has recently put out some polling on a number of these questions, including questions about late-term abortion. So could you just tell us a little bit about what some of those most recent numbers are telling us, and maybe what those implications can be as Congress is pursuing some of these pro-life items?
Well, I think it's definitely the case that when you start talking to Americans about late-term abortion, you get really positive results from Americans in general, from Republicans and from Democrats, and also from women, as Deanna mentioned. And then when you start talking about babies who've survived abortions, of course, the data is even better. So I think it would behoove the House and the Senate to continue to highlight these issues. It is a bit shocking that more members of Congress, particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle, cannot step up and say, okay, well, in one place where maybe I don't agree on every abortion issue, but I can agree that a baby who survives an abortion deserves care. And President Obama's response when this bill came up in the last Congress to the Born Alive bill was to say, excuse me, that that this would just be too much regulation of the abortion industry. So these people who really earn their livelihood by ripping babies apart have more rights than a baby who actually survives an abortion and is deserving of just basic medical care, transport to a hospital.
Thank you. And I want to make sure we have time to open questions up to folks in the audience. There's been a lot of different things that we've tried to cover, and I think that's a good problem to have, that there are so many items on the agenda, whether we're talking about regulations on conscience protections within Obamacare, or regarding enforcing existing federal conscience statutes and all of these various ways that abortion funding is being addressed, and some of the key legislation that Congress is going to be considering here in the months to come. But I know that both Autumn and Deanna are happy to elaborate on some of those topics, or if there's some additional questions that folks have. So we've got a microphone. We want to make sure that everybody who's joined us online today is able to hear not just the answer to the question, but the question itself. So if you do have a question, just raise your hand and wait until the microphone gets to you.
Hi, I'm Cynthia from Congressional Quarterly, and I had a question for Deanna about so I know that a lot of these legislations that have come through have passed the House because there's a stronger majority in the House, but there is that issue with the Senate of not having the 60 votes. Are you guys still, is it more of a messaging thing now to kind of see who to support in like the 2018 elections, or are you working to kind of to see if there are any like pro-life Democrats that you might be able to get to vote for some of these bills?
I think that definitely the 2018 elections have a huge impact on this because the people deserve to know who they're electing and whether or not they'll even stand with born-alive infants. And in light of the polling that SBA has done showing that the majority of Americans and a lot of these battleground states do support these bills, I think that it's not just a good political idea to force them to put their vote on the record, but it's good for our democracy. And I think that, especially when we talk about something like Born Alive or, the pain capable, it shouldn't be a Republican-Democrat issue. It shouldn't be a pro-life, pro-choice issue. This is about actual babies that are born, actual babies that can feel pain. The fact that it becomes boiled down to a political left or right baffles me. This is about human rights. And so I think that while the politics and the messaging is really important, I think that it should be voted on because of the fact that it still exists.
We're always looking for votes to get past the 60 vote threshold, and certainly the pain capable bill is something that some Democrats in the Senate have supported, and we hope to grow that number. We'll see how the vote plays out. There's one new senator from Alabama who has not yet voted on this issue, and certainly this is something I think the vast majority of Alabamians would agree with, that we should be protecting babies at least by 20 weeks. And then we hope that other senators who voted against the bill in the last Congress would come around and join us this time.
Hi, thank you for your work and for your time here today. I had a question regarding the Mexico City policy. Yesterday, the AP reported that essentially the reinstatement of the Mexico City policy has reduced the amount of healthcare access in developing countries. Where would you begin to look for evidence to combat that, or basically point to money being redirected rather than restricted? Thanks.
That's a great point. And I think that Marie Stopes and International Planned Parenthood announced yesterday that they're losing about $180 million because they have refused to comply with the Protecting Life policy that the Trump administration has put forward. I think what is often missed in this discussion is that the policy does not reduce the amount of money available for these services by a single penny. The money is still available. It will still be spent. It'll be spent through providers who are willing to comply with the policy, providers who are willing to set aside their extreme abortion ideology and instead really work to help both mothers and babies. So I think it's a good question. I think oftentimes the press misses the point that the funds are still there. They will still be spent. And anytime you put out $180 million are available, I would certainly hope somebody would step up and take it.
Don't be shy. Any other questions? We have a little bit more time here, maybe one or two more questions if anybody else has one.
Hi, I'm Katie with Congresswoman Vicky Hartzer's office. A question on the Title X regulations, HJ Res 43, and last week's actions. Can you tie that together for me?
Sure, it seems like we're doing the same thing over and over again, doesn't it? But we're not. It's all different pieces. So the point is that abortion providers have really kind of found a way to reach their tentacles into a lot of different places, and there are different degrees of corrective action that can be taken. So HJ Res 43 dealt with that Title X program, which is the second largest funding stream for Planned Parenthood, and that gave state flexibility within the Title X program, so untied the hands of states. The letter last week ties into the Medicaid program. So again, trying to, as much as possible through executive action, untie the hands of states to get abortion providers like Planned Parenthood out of their state program. The Title X regulations that we talked about would be adding a federal layer of program integrity to make sure that nationwide the Title X program is focused only on its core purpose, which is to provide contraception and family planning services to low-income individuals, and not to serve as a slush fund for the abortion industry. So each of these things, and of course the thing that would really address even more would be if Congress, getting past the 60-vote threshold, getting past the other hurdles that are in the way, could actually stop all funding to Planned Parenthood so that we wouldn't have to kind of do these bites around the edges.
Any other questions? Or I'll come up with one of my own. Okay, well, I will go ahead and ask one more question here, just because I think it's another important thing to keep in mind as we're framing these arguments. Obviously, defunding abortion providers in general is an ultimate goal, but obviously with Planned Parenthood really being the abortion corporation excuse me, in America, that's where a lot of the attention goes. So folks talk about defunding Planned Parenthood. It's really more broad, abortion providers more generally. Deanna, I know Americans United for Life has put out some reports talking about how Planned Parenthood really is an abortion corporation. We often hear Planned Parenthood talk about how abortion is only a tiny percentage of the work that they do, that the majority of their clinics are focusing on other family planning, cancer and prevention services. And this is something that y'all have done a lot of writing and reporting about to push back on that idea. And I think that really helps people understand why defunding this organization is so important. So could you tell us just a little overview of your investigations and what you found?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we looked at is what has been the change in the various services since Cecile Richards took over in 2006. And the results are really alarming. For an organization that claims that their motto is care no matter what, they really seem to be more about abortion no matter what. The amount of abortions has increased, I believe it's 13%. I might be a little vague on the numbers. I have them if you want to ask me for the official numbers. Off the top of my head, I think it's 13% since Cecile Richards took over. Federal funding has gone up. The number of clinics has gone down. The cancer prevention and screening services have been cut more than in half. Somewhere upwards of 60%. Even just in the last year alone, prenatal services decreased again by almost half. The vast majority of women that are pregnant that walk into a Planned Parenthood are going to leave no longer pregnant. They are not getting care for their pregnancies. They are getting abortions. I think that it was Live Action that did a great expose of Planned Parenthood proving that they don't actually offer prenatal services. They won't even give you an ultrasound unless you are coming in to get an abortion. It is part of their abortion package. And things like pap smears have gone down significantly. And even while all of this funding debate rages, their federal funding over the past decade has gone up significantly. I know that in Iowa, there was the discussion of all these Planned Parenthoods closing, and it was going to be so horrible for the women of Iowa. And it turns out that even before this happened and Iowa defunded Planned Parenthood, they voluntarily closed 6 Planned Parenthoods, even though their state funding levels had increased over the past 3 years, or at least remained steady. So they voluntarily were closing their organization's doors and not helping women. All of their cancer screenings had gone down, abortions had gone up, and it's like that all over the nation. It's not an isolated event. It has nothing to do with their funding streams because their funding has been increasing until recently. And I would definitely say go look at their report because it has better numbers than I do off the top of my head. And it's Abortion Inc. And our latest press release, whenever the last annual report came out, it can show you exactly what the numbers are. But it's very significant. And CLI did a great piece of research whenever they looked at how many of these community health centers were around. And they outnumber Planned Parenthood's 20-1. They help more than 10 times the amount of people on a yearly basis. And it's all able to be accomplished without abortions. And so we already have this infrastructure in place. If we rerouted this $500 million every year to these community health centers, it would allow them to hire more staff, expand their reach, expand their access to patients, and could take care of this problem. We don't have to fund Planned Parenthood in order to make sure that women and children and men are getting the care that they need. We can do it without them.
Great. Well, I think that's a great note to end things on because obviously we're talking about these policy proposals to get to the abortion funding question. And I think it's always great to remind people that ensuring that taxpayer dollars aren't going to the abortion industry does not have to come at the expense of women's health. And that's something that I know the pro-life movement has been very adamant about. We are pro-women, pro-babies, and so I'm glad that we were able to close on that note. I wanted to remind everybody, if you didn't have a chance to grab a copy of the new Heritage paper that we have out, I think we're out of hard copies, but those are also available online. So feel free to go and check that out, and definitely go to aul.org and sbalist.org and look at the various research papers that those groups have put out, because these reports are so helpful, not just for policymakers, but for the American people in general, to know not just what the proposals are, but why these proposals are in place to begin with. So thank you all for coming. Appreciate you being here today.